Hi, everyone on the phone. We want to thank you for joining us today for this webinar. My name is Katie Weeks. I'm the Communications Director at the Institute for Market Transformation, and I'm happy to provide the introduction to today's webinar, Making Your Voice Heard, How to Influence Utilities and to Deliver Better Energy Usage Information to Building Owners. We're presenting this webinar in association with Energy Efficiency for All, and are glad that you can all be here to join us today. We are also recording the webinar, so recording will be available after the fact. And for today's webinar, we will be taking questions throughout the webinar. Because all the lines are muted, we'll ask that if you can raise your hand through the admin panel, we will monitor questions that way throughout the presentation, and also we'll take questions at the end. So with that, I will turn things over to Kelly Crandall to lead things off with the webinar.
Hello everyone, welcome and thank you for joining us. I'll be joined by Alden Poole today, and we'll be sort of passing things back and forth. So we look forward to talking with you. So the first thing that we're going to do is just provide a very brief introduction to benchmarking, just in case we have some folks who are a little less familiar on the line, followed by some information on how benchmarking impacts utilities. And then we'll turn to our major focus for this webinar, which will be on how building owners can influence utilities to provide energy data, focusing on less formal strategies as opposed to, for example, regulatory advocacy. And so these include things like getting the ask right, what you want to make sure is included when you ask for data, as well as some ways that you might make that ask. We'll then turn to talk about some further resources that are available, and we'll do additional question and answer at the end, although as Katie noted, please feel free to raise your hand if you have a specific question. So there are two significant ways that better access to energy usage data helps building owners, landlords, and operators, given our focus here on the multifamily sector. So first, it supports whole building benchmarking, which allows them to analyze the performance of their buildings. And many building owners are now doing this using a federally funded tool called Energy Star Portfolio Manager, which compares your building to other buildings with similar characteristics. Access to energy usage data also allows for more accurate assessments of utility allowances for tenants in federally subsidized housing, which can be designed using more specific utility data to support energy efficiency investments. So this webinar is largely going to focus on the issue of building benchmarking, although with occasional reference to more individual customer data. I'll next pass things over to Alden to discuss more specifically the ways that WISHROCK has been able to use benchmarking to manage their multifamily building stock. And Alden, when you do this, you may want to briefly introduce WISHROCK's mission.
Absolutely. Good morning, everybody. Or actually, good afternoon now, unless you're on the West Coast. I wanted to introduce this chart as kind of an example of one of the many properties that WISHROCK manages. We reinvest in low-income housing properties, and specifically my role within our growing sustainability department is look for opportunities to improve net operating income by looking for efficiency opportunities and making the right investments. And really what I see as the power of benchmarking is to move a hypothesis about usage or cost into the realm of quantifiable reality, and really gives owners and operators the power to be more proactive in their actions. There's the energy savings portion of benchmarking, and then there's also that additional transparency into use and cost variation, which could be the result of overbilling. It could be the result of a spike in usage. And depending on how you collect your information, you can learn a lot more about what that spike means. Additionally, you can use this information to validate energy efficiency measures, or in the case of this example that I'm showing in the visual, this is the validation of a concern about a specific piece of equipment. So to put this graph in perspective, this was data that we've collected historically, and we used a third-party data provider that helped provide this baseline model. And so by tracking historical information, we can put that consumption in line with weather, which would be the biggest factor, and see how performance changed after a specific date. And so by looking at the space between actual, in this case, this is purchased electricity from the grid, and the baseline model, we see that after September 16, where that line is drawn, we've started purchasing a lot more electricity. And in the case of this property, I know that this is specific to a cogeneration system, and that's the result of an aging system. And it's requiring it to purchase more from the grid. So looking at energy savings with benchmarking, we can see the potential for that opportunity quantitatively. I know I can begin to use that area from electricity cost to see what the additional cost of operating an aging cogen is. And so you can really tailor the benchmarking information specific to the profile and the equipment that you operate. It's also important to be able to rule out faults or leaks in equipment that can be possible causes of these changes. And some utilities have forms of leak forgiveness in their billing structure. So it's important to quickly address those problems and also bring them up with the utility, because there could be an opportunity to credit. Also, in specific to this example, looking at an aging piece of equipment, it's important to be able to quantitatively weigh investments versus repairs, and also to quantify the cost over time of operating equipment. In looking at use and cost variation, I've seen cases where we only get cost information from a previous owner, and tracking costs alone can really hide important faults that can be revealed in benchmarking, because overbilling can occur in both cost and usage fields. With many utilities, depending on estimated reads at some point in the annual cycle, it's very important for especially an operator that makes investments in efficiency upgrades to be aware of how their utility is billing them, because that's an opportunity to seek an adjustment. Also, for customers that engage in deregulated supply markets, it's important to track cost structure, because rates may not transition when they were supposed to contractually. And so you can catch that much sooner and get credit, especially if you're during that course of, or that period of recourse, which is typically about a year. And then finally, looking at spikes in usage, it's really important, in my opinion, to use benchmarking to the full capacity that you have the ability to. And by that I mean to track whatever level of detail is available to you, because it can, in the case of this piece of equipment, which I keep referring back to, a cogen, you have both kilowatt hours and demand metered for this large of a meter. And knowing that demand spikes have a very different influence in operations than usage spikes can give an operator a lot more information, because demand could mean that the equipment is faulty versus an increase in usage could mean that the profile has changed and that there's more need for power on site. And with that, I think we should move to the next slide.
Thank you, Alden. So while a lot of building owners are undergoing benchmarking voluntarily, there's an increasing number of local and state jurisdictions that are implementing mandatory programs that require multifamily and commercial buildings to be benchmarked. So as of the last count there were 2 states, a county, and 23 cities that required it for the private sector. And its growth has made it more of a mainstream concern for utilities across the country who are being called on to provide this as a service. So Alden, does WISHROCK benchmark only in jurisdictions in which it's required, or are you all pursuing it voluntarily?
We pursue benchmarking voluntarily at all properties we look after. And we really aim to track utilities, as I said, at the specificity that is available. So cogen will track the demand. With gas, we track every point of consumption, and Also, the specific components of cost are another item, because we have seen variation in how delivery and supply costs are billed. And so for an owner that's considering on-site generation, understanding how rising delivery costs are impacting them can help move that hypothesis about action they can take to more quantifiable investment decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So when offering benchmarking data and services to customers in commercial, multifamily, and public buildings, so this has benefits for utilities, and I'll highlight a couple of them. One are that a well-designed system is ultimately going to save some time and effort. So where utilities create systems that allow them to quickly connect to customer meters and automate the upload of data to Energy Star Portfolio Manager on an ongoing basis, or at least provide it to customers very promptly and automatically, that's going to reduce some of the manual labor that you can see from one-off requests, particularly after you get through the initial setup. So for example, Consumers Energy reported that it was able to reduce the time it spent summing up the meter data for a 100-unit multifamily building from 40 hours to about 15 minutes the first time around. So when utilities are being called on to provide more and better services to customers, that kind of efficiency can be really valuable for them internally. Benchmarking also provides avenues for utilities to improve the programs that they offer to customers. For example, Pacific Gas and Electric in California is one of the utilities that's testing whether benchmarking buildings can help them identify, prioritize between, and then directly target building owners to promote deeper energy efficiency retrofits. And Eversource in Connecticut has also been providing this sort of service directly to municipalities for city buildings to help them identify retrofit opportunities. A lot of these initiatives are working with commercial and institutional buildings, but there's pretty significant opportunity for multifamily buildings too here, particularly where utilities are looking for better ways to reach landlords of and tenants in affordable housing as part of energy efficiency programs. Which brings me to this last issue, which is that providing services like benchmarking can help improve the relationship between utilities and their customers. Utilities directly care about how their customers perceive them, and energy efficiency is one of the really core avenues to build relationships with customers by providing them with advice or helping them save money or meet environmental objectives. So providing benchmarking services is something that utilities like Duke Energy Carolinas and Public Service Company of New Mexico have proposed to include as part of voluntary energy efficiency programs.
Alden, I'm going to jump in. There's a quick question from the audience about WISHROCK, and they were wondering, how does WISHROCK handle collecting and analyzing data on tenant-paid utilities?
So currently, that's a process that we've been able to successfully do at a couple of properties. And we've, I think, been most successful when we've actually had property managers as part of that process and going individually to units. So it's really a on-the-ground, direct with tenant engagement, but that is also an opportunity to have tenants become more engaged in the process themselves. And I mean, if they're sub-metered under the property, they're a paying customer of the utility themselves and should be hopefully interested in driving efficiency and lowering their own costs.
Okay, thank you.
But unfortunately, not a good universal access form for a landlord that we've found.
Thank you, and thank you for that question. So we're talking a bit about the benefits to utilities, but there are also some challenges. And just to flag, we will talk more about some of these best practices in just a second here. But the first real challenge that utilities often encounter is that mapping together meters and customer accounts into buildings can be fairly complicated because they haven't historically had that kind of insight into the geographic nature of their systems, or even that the meter and account-based customer information systems don't necessarily connect with the customer relationship systems that are used for demand-side management. So this may require connecting those databases or even creating new ones. And utilities can have a certain amount of reluctance to invest in the new infrastructure. I would note that from research we've seen, the cost to sort of get this set up and monitor it on an ongoing basis tend to be in the tens or hundreds of thousands as opposed to the millions. So that's an important thing to know. Conversely, though, I would say that the need to perform IT upgrades, which a number of utilities are facing as they modernize their grids to support advanced metering, can be an opportunity to enhance multiple IT systems at once, including these sort of customer service related ones. So the other barrier utilities face is that they may not be entirely sure of the benefit to customers from providing it. They might be trying to figure out, are customers going to request this data? What do they do with it? Would they use an automated system, or is a manual one sufficient? Evidence from anecdotes and utility filings so far is that customers pretty significantly prefer online automated data request systems, and the majority of customers tend to use those when they have options. And then finally, there are regulatory issues where you're working with an investor-owned utility that has a state public utility or public service commission, and they can be hesitant to provide benchmarking because it raises regulatory questions, and the most prominent one is how to ensure customer privacy. And utilities often have very good track records with protecting customer information, so they may not believe that they can provide building owners with their tenants' data, either due to state law or regulation, or how they typically worked with customer records internally. And I'd note that this is not an issue that's exclusive to regulated investor-owned utilities. It could occur at the municipal and cooperative level as well. There are many different types of utility management. Now, fortunately, as we'll discuss throughout this webinar, these are pretty surmountable problems, and multifamily building owners and landlords have some options to help support and influence utilities to find the solutions they need. And with that, we'll move on to the two really big topics that we want to cover here when it comes to working with utilities to develop better access to whole building data. And so there's two things. There's what you ask for, and there's how you ask for it. And we'll cover each of these in turn. The first step here is being very clear about what you need and what the ask is. And we'll cover 4 best practices here. I'll try to go through it pretty briefly, and then I'll turn it over to Alden to describe WISHROCK's more practical experience in working with these practices. So the biggest thing is to ask your utility directly for the types of data you need to perform benchmarking and manage your buildings. And so this may be aggregated whole building data, or as you all were discussing, it may be individual tenant data in some cases. From the benchmarking side, ideally multifamily building owners are going to get access both to how much energy is used and how much that energy costs, broken down into fixed charges, taxes, fees, and so forth. But at this point, not every utility is submitting cost data to Energy Star Portfolio Manager, so that may require comparing information across bills and other documents. And generally, you're going to need at least 2 years worth of data broken down by month to make sure that you've identified any issues due to weather. Not every utility provides 12 separate months. Not every utility provides at least 24 months historic information. So those are good things to be sure you're asking for. The next thing is you want to ask for any customer privacy standards that the utility requires, either from a managerial standpoint or from a legal and regulatory standpoint, to just be reasonable and appropriate to the situation. Generally, for a benchmarking use case, utilities and commissions have found that a lower standard is more than sufficient to protect privacy. They'll look at aggregating 2 to 5 tenants within a building. It's fairly common to see 3, 4, or 5 tenants being collected prior to being released to a building owner, and otherwise individual consent forms may be required. AB 802 in California, so state law now requires them to aggregate at a level of 3 active accounts, but there are a number of other examples around the country. So there's a question also of how to validate that the property owner or their authorized manager is who they say they are. In that process, some utilities require submission of contracts, or they may manually verify property records to check this out. However, others use a slightly different approach based on the assumption that the owner of the building would have access to certain information about tenants, like meter numbers that are accessible in a meter bank that they can see. Now, while this is useful and that it's available to the building owner, it can also create opportunities for error in transcribing and then the utility having to validate that, and so that can be kind of time consuming. Xcel Energy, for example, uses an alternative approach which connects meters to buildings through their geographic information system. So there are a few different approaches that you can look at for that, and it's important for utilities and building owners to be communicating with each other about what makes sense to validate ownership. Another best practice is for utilities to provide building owners their data through standardized and automated systems, and I'll highlight a couple of dimensions of this. First, for those buildings with a lower number of tenants, utilities should have standardized consent forms that the building owner can submit. As Alden was mentioning, it's pretty rare to see something standardized across service territories. However, electronic is a good place to start, at least, an electronic submission process. Some utilities do require email copies of PDFs, or in the past have required even hard copy paper forms. That is sort of becoming a less prominent practice. A better approach would tend to be for a building owner or landlord to initiate an online request, perhaps for a tenant to provide approval. And an example of one way that this has worked that is not necessarily specific to tenant landlord, but where utilities are using Green Button Connect systems or the Smart Meter Texas approach, which allows people to consent to share their information electronically. The second thing to be aware of is, as we've discussed, the automated transfer of data from utility systems to Energy Star Portfolio Manager, and this can often be done on an ongoing basis. So it might be updated on a monthly or annual level. This reduces manual errors, and it can be a huge time saver, particularly with large properties with many units. It also ensures that the building owner will continue getting their data going forward and will be able to set a baseline and test the impact of interventions, as you could see with what Alden was showing in his slides earlier. Using this automated system provides a big benefit for utilities as well, as they can receive basic information back about buildings that could potentially improve their forecasting of how and when and where customers are using electricity. And just something to note is that ease of use is important in implementing an online system. This is not directly applicable, again, to landlord-tenant interactions, but in California and Texas, the Public Utilities Commissions have started to look at the impact of user-friendliness on whether customers voluntarily make energy decisions, like sign up for demand response programs or transfer their retail provider. And there's evidence out there that being able to access one-click ordering or signing up for new services using your existing accounts has really raised our expectations for online interactions. And so as you're working with your utility, I think it's helpful to help them understand how to make that process easy for customers and not require extra logins or really complicated multi-click processes. And then finally, multifamily building owners in particular, because they deal with so many tenants, may want to recommend that utilities create solutions that provide them with the ability to take care of multiple functions at once. And just as an example, the same online interface that could be used to request whole building data could also be used to manage transfers of service between tenants or requests for individual tenant data with consent. And so there are a few examples of this, not too many out there, but there's the Landlord Utility Services portal by Consumers Energy in Michigan that started bundling some of these functionalities. And with that, I'll turn it back to Alden to talk a little bit more about the specifics of what WISHROCK has seen.
Thank you, Kelly. Kelly really laid a good overview of the current landscape, and we've come across the full spectrum from very limited, no online access with semi-annual bills, and that's going to be something that you'll come across most frequently with water. We've found that that's most commonly the municipally billed utility and often has the most outdated IT systems. And that really is limiting from the perspective of trying to benchmark, because without a good relationship with the utility and that level of access, it really limits the property owner to scrubbing those invoices, which I know many people who do not enjoy that process as a former analyst. Looking at portals, electronic copies of invoices is what I hope to find at a minimum, and quick information on the relative changes in metered use year over year, which is important to account for that seasonality, and is the reason that we look to collect those 2 years at a minimum. I really will seek to get as much historical information as possible, because it's much easier to get when there's an opportunity to than when you're looking to get it at some point in the future. And you may find it has more use than you had originally anticipated as you find out about changes that a previous property owner made, or you determine the date of installation of a certain piece of equipment. Regarding consent forms, there are some that require as few fields as just a billing zip code and an account number, which in my opinion would be the ideal way to be able to access this information, especially when properties are transitioning between ownership. That's the type of information that's really easy to get during the period that the deal is being evaluated. And you can get an invoice that has both the billing zip code and the account number on it, and plug that into an online database and quickly have a much clearer understanding of the energy profile that you're considering bringing into your own portfolio. Best practices, I really think it's a benefit when a utility has a dedicated point of contact, especially specific to the property type. This really helps to leverage any available incentives that the utility may have. And often, any benchmarking data that you've done in advance is really critical to being able to fully realize what you can invest into existing opportunities. Full building data, when it's available for submetered buildings, makes it much easier to locate inefficiencies and also leverage additional soft money sources that may be available to improve the durability of the asset. And when this isn't captured during a rehabilitation stage and the utility costs aren't incurred directly by the building owner, I believe that efficiency investments are much less likely to occur. So having that opportunity to look at the time that the building is about to go into rehabilitation is a great time to fast-track benchmarking. Also, access to detailed smart meter information is a huge benefit. The graph that you see is output from a utility in Tennessee called Electric Power Bureau, or Electric Power Board, excuse me. And this is what I would expect to see for a typical multifamily property with peaking afternoon load. But this really gives us an opportunity to see how this load may change over time. And since I get an email every day, I can quickly compare how the profile may change day over day. So if there's an anomaly in usage, I can quickly notify site staff to look into any potential issue that may exist. Another really big benefit to find is an Excel-based data download. That's really great to be able to build up a historical profile and not have to scrub information. Although, and I just want to touch on some of the things that are more difficult to run across, you will find broken data feeds. We've come across online portals that don't provide any estimate of when the service will be restored. I've also come across bond requirements that were a necessary part of getting the account registered, and things that you should be concerned about in terms of practices are a lack of indication of estimated or actual readings, which can really become a more significant issue when estimated reads dominate an entire annual read cycle, which we've also come across. And with that, I'd like to turn it back to you, Kelly.
Thank you for sharing those. And with that, we'll turn more to sort of the how to ask utilities for the information you're looking for. And in this process, we're going to focus more on informal or semi-formal strategies and less on regulatory and legislative approaches, which have been taken in some parts of the country like California and Colorado, where state law and regulatory rulemakings have helped define the access to benchmarking data. Although to the extent that you all have questions in that vein, we can discuss that during the Q&A. But we'll look at 3 different strategies, and I'll turn the first 2 over to Alden to talk about how to make it concrete and how to find internal champions within a utility, areas that he has a lot of experience in, and then I will talk a little bit more about other informal and semi-formal strategies related to building coalitions and using your voice as a customer. So Alden?
Thank you. In making it concrete, I think it's important to describe the benefits of your intent rather than just the subject of your request. In that, I mean, rather than requesting the 2 years worth of property data, you could alternatively explain that you're trying to build an energy profile to understand what equipment you can upgrade to benefit tenants at your property. And as Kelly said, you're a customer, and each account deserves service by the utility. And in my opinion, each account deserves an itemized list of billed costs or a receipt, much like we do and receive for other services that we purchase. However, I think it's also important to understand that our existing utility systems are imperfect, and there are people everywhere trying to improve those systems. So despite coming across a city that may lack an online portal, you have an opportunity to call, wait on hold, speak to somebody directly, and find out how you can make a request despite them not necessarily having instructions clearly laid out on how to do so. And I've followed that exact process and been able to get multiple years worth of water data to complete the full profile of a property that we'd waited months to try to get access to. By calling utility departments, you afford yourself a better audience to explain your goal. And it is not uncommon to get differing service from the same utility depending on your point of contact. So be patient, calm, and as detailed as possible with your questions. If you exceed the understanding of the person you're speaking with, they will likely elevate your question to the person they feel would be the best resource. So for example, when I asked about a utility being open to us as the customer providing ultrasonic water metering at a property, I was elevated quickly to a manager who moved our account questions along more in that day than we had in months. And subsequently, I'd like to follow up on that because we just found out yesterday that we're getting a $21,000 credit, which is about a sixth of the billed water costs from last year because of elevating that issue. And that was also the result of benchmarking and seeing usage out of line, digging into that further, seeing the prevalence of estimated reads, and doing further analysis and evaluating that in a very strategic way. But that was made possible by benchmarking. By looking for these advocates, they'll not only help you in your pursuit of whole building data, but I think they also help to make you aware of other opportunities for funding that you may not have otherwise have known about. They're also the ones that know when these programs may be expiring or are pending to be renewed or what may be on the horizon. So having that additional foresight into an investment timeline can be very significant, especially if you're considering making decisions about central systems. So feel empowered to ask questions and make requests because ultimately you are the utilities customer.
Thank you, Alden. So Alden talked about the benefits of providing really concrete information and building a relationship with the utility one-on-one as a customer. And I'll talk about some other informal or semi-formal strategies you may also want to consider. The first thing is that it's really critical to build coalitions of stakeholders. Multifamily building owners and landlords are critical participants here because they're going to be the ones using the data, and so they should be engaged on the types of data they need, how systems can be created that make it more straightforward for them to benchmark. And it's also important to involve large commercial, industrial, or institutional customers. Just as examples, hospitals, schools, or universities, they often have very large property portfolios. And depending on your state, you may want to include state energy offices or your regional energy efficiency organization, the RIO, as they frequently work with utilities on all kinds of different programs, including energy efficiency or weatherization or energy code compliance. And just as an example, the National Association of State Energy Offices has a resolution that encourages its state offices to support better access to benchmarking data, and that invokes some of the best practices we've discussed. Another important stakeholder is your municipal government, a city or county, especially cities that are considering or have implemented ordinances that require benchmarking. They can be conveners for these stakeholders, but so can regional nonprofits or other entities. And the Better Buildings Energy Data Accelerator through Department of Energy completed in 2015 and has a number of resources that speak in more detail about how to determine if you want a more or less formal process for engaging stakeholders. And I'll speak about a specific example from Salt Lake City shortly that came about during that process. But just in practice, you're probably going to want to distinguish people who need to come to agreement on an overall policy, like whether data should be provided automatically to customers, such as through Portfolio Manager, as opposed to people who can really work through the mechanics, like whether a utility requires a building owner to provide meter numbers or verify tenant names, or how they do that mapping and do that authorization and so forth. Now, outside of participating in working groups or technical advisory groups to hash out how things will work, these coalitions can be really valuable because they bring influential customers and constituencies together. So in some cases, building owners have banded together to make a formal written request of their utility management, or they've provided utilities of support for best practices. And BOMA, for example, has submitted letters of support for commercial buildings and property managers. This approach can help customers emphasize to their utilities how important a particular service is to them, and it can help them lay out kind of that ask. And it can also provide support to the utility if it has to demonstrate the usefulness of a benchmarking service, such as to their regulator or to the state consumer advocates who engage with the utility at the regulatory level in a more formal setting. We're collecting some examples of these kinds of letters, and if that's something that you're interested in, please feel free to email me. And I'll give you one example of how this less formal work can be helpful if you enter into a more formal process, such as at the state regulatory level. One way that benchmarking programs have showed up on a voluntary basis is in utilities' energy efficiency and demand-side management filings. And that can happen, depending on the utility, it might be utility-specific or statewide for multiple utilities. But these are generally annual or a few-year plans that lay out the specifics of programs and what energy savings goals utilities have and how they'll spend money and on what types of customers. These plans might, in some cases, include an automated data transfer system as a cost. For example, ComEd in Illinois has included this more in the marketing line item as it helps drive customer participation in other areas. However, there are other utilities that seek credit for saving energy from offering benchmarking as part of a program focused on business customers, and Duke Energy Carolinas in both North and South Carolina offers a program like that. Now, the same large customers, state agencies, and so forth that you want to talk to about helping set up a benchmarking program can be very helpful in supporting these program structures. And to the extent that there are questions that need to come up, in, like cost recovery for benchmarking services, you can work with them to help them understand how valuable this is and provide concrete examples from your experience as evidence. And so that can help support a more formal process in the longer run. And very often utilities have voluntary stakeholder engagement processes too, where they will solicit ideas that lead up to the filing of an energy efficiency plan. So that can be a good opportunity to get involved earlier in the process and propose these sorts of things that you're looking for. And I'll just note that if you're on your way to this kind of process, it's really valuable to explore ways to meet with utility regulators and inform them about your issues. And that's the kind of thing that you want to check the legal requirements for in your state, because there can be restrictions on how to do that, but not many people end up doing it. And one good example of where the Public Utility Commission was involved in this discussion was in Pennsylvania. Because there were pre-existing proceedings that are related to data privacy and smart metering. The chair of the PUC was actually involved in overseeing stakeholder working groups and discussions around data access, which led to a few solutions there, including the use of automated data transfer. And I'll speak briefly about one example of how to pair these informal, semi-formal, and formal strategies. Which is the City of Salt Lake City, which participated in the Better Buildings Energy Data Accelerator with Rocky Mountain Power, its electric utility, and Questar, its gas utility. And I'll focus a little more on RMP here. That the objective was to develop strategies to support data access for building owners. And Salt Lake City had also recently joined the City Energy Project to explore opportunities to increase energy efficiency in commercial buildings, and was also in the process of renegotiating its franchise with RMP. So in this case, the city worked in coordination with Utah Clean Energy, which is a nonprofit with pretty significant utility experience, to engage local stakeholders. And there are a couple of strategies that contributed to the success in this particular example. The first being that the conveners brought together stakeholders in a number of different formats, including one-on-one meetings and informal and semi-formal working groups. And many of these stakeholders came directly to Rocky Mountain Power's headquarters for in-person meetings. And second, large customers and benchmarking users were core to this discussion. So among the large customer participants were the school district and Intermountain Healthcare, which is a multi-state Western healthcare provider that's headquartered in Salt Lake City. And additionally, the Utah chapter of the Building Owners and Managers Association, so BOMA, sent a letter of support directly to RMP that was signed by large local property owners like CBRE. So these stakeholders were able to help identify the benefits of benchmarking and how it could be made easier for them, and work directly to communicate that. And finally, going back to the points that Alden mentioned, one thing that was mentioned to me was that some of the account managers that customers were working with had many years of experience working at RMP, and they were really able to help internally identify those people who needed to be involved and facilitate conversations with them. And Rocky Mountain Power itself has emphasized how important it was to hear directly from their customers and to have a way to come to compromises on different things, like how they approached aggregation and implementing automated benchmarking. And another thing that was helpful for them was they were also considering updating some of their customer information systems, and so they were able to create some synergies there. To put all of this together, here's a brief list of steps that you can think of to influence utilities positively to provide consistent, accurate, and useful building data to support benchmarking and other energy management programs. And again, I'll just emphasize that this focuses more on the informal and semi-formal strategies, but that many of these lessons are extremely applicable in more formal settings as well. I'll highlight a couple of resources here, and then we can turn to the questions. I wanted to highlight 3 reports that have come out over the years that may be useful to you all in this process. The first is an IMT report discussing the benefits to utilities of benchmarking, and we have some more updated materials in the works on this topic. The next is a report from the Energy Data Accelerator through Better Buildings, where they paired utilities and local governments. And this one highlights best practices, but they have an entire toolkit of resources, including a number focusing on stakeholder engagement strategies, which includes some of the examples I talked about today. And then finally, Energy Efficiency for All, who we appreciate as our partner on this webinar, very recently released a report that I recommend you all take a look at, as it breaks down examples of interfaces that utilities are providing to customers to conduct benchmarking and other activities relevant to multifamily building owners. And it does in particular focus on some of the more aspects of consumers' energies portals and programs, which I had mentioned earlier in the session. And there are also a couple of website resources that track energy policies on an ongoing basis. I'll just flag the Energy Star map, where you can look up your utilities data policies by zip code, and then the HUD Exchange, where they actually look a little bit more at functionality of the programs and kind of rank what data services utilities provide. Thank you all very much for your time today. We're ready to take any questions, and I would also just put out a quick ask to you all. If you are willing to share any experiences you've had in requesting benchmarking data and what strategies you found to be effective, we're more than happy to hear it.
Okay, thanks, Kelly. So we did have one question that came in, and as a reminder, everyone can submit questions through the panel of the webinar system. But we did have one question for you, Alden, and that was, does WISHROCK use energy consumption information and efficiency attributes to impact its appraisal and valuation of properties WISHROCK is planning to buy or sell?
Absolutely. We attempt to gain as much property information as we can, as early in the process as we can. And I've been working to develop a memo that we can actually give to our developers that are going out to have kind of an action list of where we can begin collecting that information and explaining the value of it, because there are existing properties that have an ability to improve their operating expenses, and that can be part of how that property can be reinvested in. So absolutely, I think there's an ability to benchmark before you own a property, and you can begin working with other partners to also evaluate how efficiency investments could improve that. For example, Energy Trust of Oregon will do an on-site evaluation before you even own a property, and will also provide an estimate of what the savings would be for implementing those changes. So there are some really good resources out there, and I think it should be something people pay very close attention to.
All right, thank you. And just other attendees requested to see the resources again, so you can see them in here. And we'll also switch back so you can all get Kelly and Alden's contact information in a few minutes. Alden, there was one other follow-up question that came in response to the earlier question about how WISHROCK handles collecting and analyzing data on tenant-paid utilities. In your response, you made a comment about tenant-paid utility, that tenants get the savings, but was any investment made by the building owner? And the follow-up question was, what about adjustment to utility allowances?
We definitely are looking to use this information to inform the utility allowance going forward. So that's definitely a consideration to be made in using this benchmarking information. So yeah, I would agree with that point and confirm it.
Okay, those are all the questions that we've had come in. If anyone has any last-minute questions, now is the time to submit them. Otherwise, we will go ahead and wrap up. As a reminder, this webinar was recorded today, so a recording will be available afterwards, and we will probably post the slides as well. We've done that in the past. So without any more questions coming in, thank you to Kelly and Alden for sharing all this information today, and thank you to all of our attendees for joining us. We hope you enjoyed the webinar and your time with us today. Thank you again.